reductio ad absurdum is a form of argumentation, a critical form of argumentation, whereby an original premise that may make some sense on its face is refuted by using logic to reduce that premise to a necessary conclusion that is patently false because it's obviously absurd. You've reduced a position to absurdity, and once you get to that point, the opponent in a debate has to abandon their original premise because they realize that it necessarily leads to an absurd conclusion. So in that case, you cannot not have both. Say the necessary conclusion is false, while still maintaining the original premise is true. It's not logically tenable. So I think in this case, so it's just a Latin phrase for, I think, reduced to absurdity, reductio ad absurdum. And so I think it can be applied to the case of trans athletes that are biologically male, thinking they should be able to compete in the female categories of girls and women's. And so, I mean, if you take that to its logical conclusion, that premise that trans athletes should be able to compete in the girls or women's categories, even though they're biologically male, then that leads to the conclusion that any male athlete should be able to compete in a girls or women's category just by identifying as a female. It's something that they can just self-identify as a female, so they could wouldn't matter what sport you were talking about. It would be you'd be come to an absurd reality whereby it would just kind of nullify the whole idea of having girls or women's categories. And now it shouldn't matter in terms of finding out whether the principle is involved here, whether that's okay or not, whether that should be acceptable. It should not matter how common it is. It may not be terribly common. It may be very uncommon for this instance to whereby the biological males, these trans athletes, want to compete in the girls or women's categories. It may be rare, but you still need to determine whether or not, in principle, it is acceptable or not, because it obviously has been happening in some cases, in some significant cases, such as the swimmer in a college who was actually won the NCAA title, who was a biological male but competed in the women's category in collegiate swimming. So that was really difficult for this person's competitors. The biological male was competing. So that was this is really like the highest level, Division I swimming, and they really devote so much. The competitors, there are actual biological females. They're spend so much time and energy and dedication into the sport, especially at that level, and then had to have all the chances of winning a title, or in some cases of losing a spot on the team because there's a biological male who has all that necessary advantages, eliminating that chance of a title or a place on the team. That's obviously unfair, and it's, I think, obviously absurd to think that something like a biological characteristic can be self-identified. that would make no more sense than if a 300-pound wrestler in collegiate wrestling decides that the wrestler identifies as being a featherweight, therefore should be allowed to compete in the lightest weight category. That's absurd. Of course, that would not be fair to the wrestlers that actually qualify in that category of the latest category, who have worked so hard to make weight. And that also brings up another point of, when the trans athletes are denied being able to participate, that's supposedly so harmful to them psychologically. But those categories do not exist, gender categories do not exist for the purpose of affirming someone's psychologically their gender identity. That's not why they exist. Just as that the weight categories in weight sports such as wrestling or Olympic weightlifting or powerlifting, those categories do not exist either for the psychological affirmation of the athlete's identity as being in a certain weight class. I'm sure in some cases the athletes, when they're not able to make weight, maybe it's very devastating. I don't know. Supposing some wrestler says, "Oh, I really thought I'd make my weight category I was shooting for, but I didn't. The scale's not showing it, so I'm devastated. Ooh, oh, I didn't make it. Please let me go in the lighter weight category, even though I didn't make weight." And then I imagine the weight judges say, "Oh, I guess I didn't realize it would be so hard on you. Oh, okay, you go ahead and compete in the lighter weight. I don't want to hurt your feelings." Of course, that would never be done. That's not why the weight categories exist, and that's not why the gender categories exist either. It's not for the psychological affirmation of a athlete's gender identity. They exist for the purpose of fairness. That's it. That's all. That's the only reason these gender categories exist, and so there's, but yeah. So it's just these politicians are just really and activist groups. They're really confusing the whole purpose of these gender categories when they try to introduce these other red herrings of psychological identity, self-identity, and affirmation. It's all non sequiturs. It's nothing to do with the reason for gender categories. And I think it's kind of interesting, when we talk about politics, is that it's due to there's all sorts of woke lefty Democrats are supporting the general woke principles, and this push for allowing trans athletes to compete in the female categories comes out of that whole woke ideology. But the interesting point there, though, is that the idea of allowing females to compete in allowing biological males to compete in the female category is a particularly unpopular idea across the political spectrum. Nobody seems to like it. That's hyperbole. Some do. But overall, it's a very unpopular idea from when I've been reading all sorts of articles, tweets about this subject. There really is not a lot of support for it. Allowing trans athletes to compete in the girls or women's categories. There does not seem, across the political spectrum, it's a very unpopular position. It's kind of interesting. So maybe this is something that should be pushed in the case of the Republicans, where they could say, well, they could, in a debate, they could ask their opponent, their Democrat, do you or do not support allowing trans athletes to compete? compete as women. And they could it's kind of a lose-lose situation for the Democrats, because they want to still be woke, but they don't want to put out a political position that is so unpopular. I mean, imagine all these so-called soccer moms that tend to be loyal Democrats, and they don't like the idea of having their daughters competing. It's not necessarily just soccer, then all sorts of different sports, hockey, basketball, swimming, track and field, you name it. They don't want their daughters having to compete against biological boys, or have to lose the spot in their daughters in a team. They don't want that. I think it's, well, most people recognize how absurd this is, and how wrong it is to allow the biological females to compete in the girls or women's categories, and so including this so-called Democrat soccer moms. And so you can like in a debate, you debate the Republicans. They could push. They should maybe should push the issue. It could back their Democrat opponents into a corner there, where the lose-lose for them, because if they oppose allowing the trans athletes to compete in the girls category, then they'll appear as not being woke. But if they support it, then it'll mean these soccer moms' daughters might have to go against their boys even though it's a girls' sport. So yeah, maybe the Republicans should push this issue and make it more well known. Even push it against their opponents in a debate. I'd like to see that. That'd be kind of funny. So yeah, that's the main thing I wanted to put forward here. Hope I presented some good ideas. So if you're still watching, thanks for watching.